Thank you very much and welcome everyone. I hope that wherever you are in the world, that you and your families are safe and well. Today's session is all about an update on the next phase of PRI's reporting and an assessment framework. It's a really important topic as reporting is the one area that touches all of our signatories, whether you're large or small, old or newer to responsible investment, and no matter what corner of the world you're in, everybody needs to report. So in today's session, our aim is to outline why we undertook the review of reporting, how we've gone about it, what we've done and what the changes have been that we've made, and what's the rationale behind some of the decisions we've made and the review. But before I bring in the panel, I just wanted to take a few minutes to give you some background on the changes we're making. So the PRI committed to undertake an extensive review of the reporting framework, really as part of our 10-year blueprint. The aim of the review was to ensure that our reporting and assessment has a clear objective of how it will contribute to driving change in the investment industry, that it's fit for purpose, that it remains relevant to evolving responsible investment practices, that it's useful for signatories in the responsible investment market, and of course that it helps to drive accountability and meet the objectives of Principle 6. So our new reporting framework has been developed after a really extensive consultation, which began in 2008, and that's involved not only the whole of the PRI, but it's also involved our board, our reporting committee, it's involved signatories and other stakeholders. We've listened to signatory feedback. You told us that you wanted a simpler framework, that reporting had become very time consuming, that there was duplication, and that the outputs could be more user friendly. And after an extensive period of work, we're really now delighted to be able to formally launch the new reporting framework. So we're going to start with a short video that'll give you a bit of an overview of the new framework, and then I'll introduce our panel and we'll get into the detail. Now, let me welcome our panel, Faith Ward, who's Chief Responsible Investment Officer at Brunel, Brian Minns, Manager of Sustainable Investing at Addenda Capital, and Elina Rolfe, who's the Director of Reporting and Assessment here at the PRI. So I'm going to start off with a question to both Faith and Brian. So as signatories to the PRI, I wanted to get your take on why you think it's important that we've really embarked on the review of the reporting framework. So I might start with you, Faith.
Thank you, Fiona. And I think a lot of my reasons as a signatory and as a user of the reporting framework very mirror some of the feedback and some of the comments you've already made. I mean, we very much use it as a tool for internal benchmarking, so I need it to kind of follow best practice, so I can use it in that regard. We use it quite extensively in the selection, appointment and monitoring of managers, so I need it to be more demanding and stretching, so I can delineate between what managers are actually doing in reality. And I think selfishly, maybe my other motivation for wanting you to review it is I did want it to be less painful. I've been very much, I know I spend quite a lot of the time doing it, and I think there were elements where we could make it more efficient and user-friendly for our signatory base. So those were sort of some of my motivations for wanting to support the review and welcome it.
Brian, what's your views?
Sure. Thanks, Fiona. So first I'll echo what Faith said. So it's an important tool for us internally in terms of our continuous improvement of our sustainable investing practices at Addenda. And it's something that I've heard from many signatories as we've gone through this whole review process. But the other piece of the puzzle is I think that responsible investing practices have changed a lot in the last 10 years since there was an update. And so we need to make sure that the framework was able to evolve and capture what's changed, but also set it up for the future so that it can capture how things are going to evolve in the future. We have to be able to help signatories answer questions like, are there new practices we should be adopting? Are we doing enough? Are we making progress that we committed to in Principle 6? And the other piece, as you touched on at the beginning as well, is around accountability. So that's one of the tools. The reporting and assessment framework is one of the key tools that we have to support the accountability of the signatories. And so, signing up to the PRI shouldn't be taken lightly, obviously, as you know, and we want to have that tool in place that helps the PRI hold signatories accountable.
So I just want to elaborate for the audience a little bit on the review process, just for a few minutes, because it has been something that's been underway since 2018. It has been a very extensive consultation. So we had 2 formal signatory consultations, as this has been really an iterative process. We've gone out, we've got information, we've put together our outline, we've gone back to the signatory base. We've also involved the Reporting and Assessment Advisory Committee, which is made up of our signatories, and we've got a directional steer from the PRI board throughout the review and through the development process for the framework. We've worked internally with our specialist teams to ensure that reporting really does reflect best practice when it comes to responsible investment, but of course to make sure that it's also aligned with our most recent PRI guidance papers. We've also used detailed signatory focus groups for the testing for both the reporting framework content, but also for the new reporting tool itself, which has really been embedded in the development of the new framework, and it's confirmed that PRI reporting is heading in the right direction. So again, I want to come back to you, Brian and Faith. How do you think that the Reporting and Assessment Advisory Committee, or RAC as we call it, of which you're both members, how have you been involved in the process and how have you provided input? And maybe I'll start with you this time, Brian.
Well, I think the role that the RAC has played has largely been around sort of providing that feedback and input to the staff. So I just want to reiterate, you went through, but the staff has played a key role in sort of, it's been a long process and a lot of inputs and aggregating information that they've been working on. And so the RAC, our role has been to provide feedback and on certain touch points along the way. As the staff have worked with the board, have worked with, as you mentioned, other staff within the PRI and the investment practices teams, coordinating the signatory feedback, developing the framework, testing the framework, and so on. So there's just been a lot of opportunity for the signatories through the RAC to provide input at certain touch points. But our role has been limited to that sort of feedback to the staff.
And Faith.
Yeah, I think a lot of that. I mean, we many of us participated quite actively in the workshops and encouraging kind of dialogue. I think we've also been championing it within our kind of investor networks more locally in trying to engage people to kind of respond to the consultations and to draw out and to facilitate some of those dialogues with other members of the sort of the asset owner and asset manager community, so we can really get a sense of what their needs were. So really helping to get that feedback into the PRI. And as Brian indicates, a lot of the time has also been spent in doing kind of deeper dives and providing specific support and specific questions, particularly where perhaps there was a variety of views from a stakeholder base, and be able to provide then that the diversity which is in the RAC itself, is to kind of therefore come up with some solutions and mediate some ideas around some of those where there was divergence of views.
And I really do have to thank you both, but also thank the committee for all the work that they've been putting into making sure that this is all heading in the right direction. Of course, the main objective of reporting and assessment is really about driving change within the industry and making sure that that's positive change, and really to ensure that the reporting framework reflects signatory feedback and that it meets the overarching goal of driving that positive change in the investment market. So again, I might start with you, Faith, but what are the most important points that you thought the PRI should address as part of this review to make sure that we were meeting all of the objectives that signatories had?
No, thank you, Fiona. I mean, as I indicated, one of my main use cases around that selection and monitoring of managers. So I just needed the framework to be harder to game, if you like, and to also to stretch, if you like, the scores that the managers were likely to get from that, and to be able to really scrutinise what was actually happening. So to provide sort of that more sort of deeper and more nuanced analysis of their practices. Again, it was reflecting the fact that we need, as Brian's indicated, as you have indicated, the world has moved on quite rapidly, and there was therefore a need for refreshment in that regard. But I think also there's the outcomes focus. We need to the framework needed to be more aligned to where we're trying to get to, rather than just a reporting of kind of the processes and the way we went around things. It had to kind of focus on the direction of travel and what we were trying to achieve because of it.
Brian.
Sure. I think, I echo everything that Faith said, but in particular, I focus in on accountability again. So that's a key aspect that has always been a part of the reporting and assessment process, but it continues to be important. I mean, the PRI signatory base has been growing so quickly, and the industry appears to be adopting a lot of these practices over time. So, as you well know, there's more than 600 new signatories in the last year alone. So we've got more than 3,000 signatories. But what does it mean to be a signatory? What should it mean? So the reporting framework needs to keep pace and enable that implementation of the minimum standards. So what it means to be a PRI signatory, and then to give the market in general that comfort that it means something to be a PRI signatory. So this is one of the tools at the disposal of the PRI to help enable that accountability. But there's Faith went through a number of different objectives of the reporting and assessment review, but there are other objectives, obviously around the continuous learning, driving change, obviously at the heart of a lot of what is going on with this review, benchmarking data that we use, so we look at what our peers are doing and so on. So there were lots of competing interests, but for me, it was the accountability that rose to the top.
Yeah, there's definitely lots of competing ways that we have to try to bring about this review, and lots of different things that people wanted. We really wanted to make sure that the reporting requirements sort of evolved and that they were more challenging, because as you talked about, responsible investments continued to grow over the time that we've had reporting in place. But we also wanted to make it simpler, and we wanted to make sure that there was a lot more consistency, and also that we delivered improved and really more flexible outputs. So I'm going to bring you in now, Elina, and Elina's sort of been the whole driving force internally behind the review. Can you talk a little bit about how the development of the new reporting framework has really followed the guiding points that everyone's just outlined as we've been discussing it?
Thanks, Fiona. So we had three principles that we sort of followed. So firstly, it was to create a simpler reporting framework, and not easier, but simpler. So seasoned reporters will know that we had various types of questions. Some were mandatory, some were voluntary, some were public, some were not public. Some were assessed and some were not, and then there were combinations of those. So as you can imagine, that can be quite confusing. So firstly, we wanted to create something that was quite clear and clean. So we came up with this core plus concept. So we have core questions that are mandatory, They're public, they're assessed, they're reasonably stable, and they're mostly closed-ended. And then we have plus questions that are voluntary to report. You can choose if you choose to publish the responses to those questions, and they are not assessed. They are often free text or open-ended questions, and this is a space where we can sort of really understand more advancing practices that might not be tested in the market. So that hopefully will just make it sort of the structure of the framework to be clearer and easier to understand and follow. And then something that I'm sure that everyone will be quite happy about is also that we set out to shorten it. So we set ourselves a goal to shorten it by half, and we got immediately scared about this really ambitious goal, but we actually have done that. We have cut out 50% of our indicators, so I'm sure that everybody's going to be pleased about that. And then also, Fiona mentioned earlier, we also had a focus on the reporting tools, so the platforms that you will be using when you're reporting, so making those easier to use, user-friendlier. So that was one of our guiding principles. The second one was to create something that's more involved and more challenging. So this is what I was saying, simpler but not easier. So when we started 2006, we had something that we called self-assessment, and that essentially was that. Signatories were saying how well they thought they were incorporating ESG. And then 2012, and almost 10 years ago now, we came up with the framework that we now have. And really what we are capturing now in the framework is, do any of our signatories do anything somewhere in their practices? And that was challenging for a lot of our signatories back then, but really isn't anymore. And it's not enough anymore because everyone is doing something somewhere in their practices. So we really wanted to look at a framework that looks at the depth and breadth of ESG incorporation, and really looking at to what extent has ESG been mainstreamed throughout our signatories' practices. So I think that's really an important part. So therefore, this will also enable the differentiation that Faith and Brian has been talking about. And it leads to my third point, which is the third guiding principle, which was the outputs. And this is really about rebalancing the sort of the input versus output. And I think it's really important that the reporting should be really insightful. The process of it, the questions that we're asking should be important, pertinent, and the right questions that allow signatories to learn and understand, and also the user of the outputs to understand what good practice is, what innovative practice is, and so sort of through that we also want to ensure that there's flexibility in what kind of outputs you're able to get. We want to provide more visualization, but I think most important is the link between these three guiding principles, that by improving the questions, we're able to provide more insightful and meaningful outputs. So what goes in is hopefully easier but still challenging, and therefore what comes out is really valuable for our signatories.
So when it comes to the content, really the whole content of the reporting framework has been overhauled, but yet I think that signatories will still recognise many of the same themes in the new reporting framework that were covered in the former framework. But some of the main changes include an introduction of a new sustainability outcomes set of indicators which are in the core, and that's really to capture how signatories assess and understand sustainability outcomes and how signatories may be measuring these outcomes, and a new plus module that will capture also what's happening with sustainability outcomes of investments. And then we've got an integration of TCFD aligned indicators, which will also be in the core. We've got integration of stewardship throughout the reporting framework. Therefore, stewardship will no longer have a separate score, but it will feed into the assessment of each asset class. And we're also introducing a C-level statement. So I want to come back to each of you on why it's really important with this new reporting framework to introduce sustainability outcomes, that it's not just about thinking about policy and process. So I might start with you first, Brian.
Sure, thanks, Fiona. So I think the outcomes piece is so vitally important. So if we look back, so a few years ago, as you at the PRI were putting together the blueprint and thinking about what the next 10 years might look like for sustainable finance, for responsible finance, and so on, I think it became pretty clear that we need to spend more time on the real world outcomes of our actions. So, the decisions that we make in finance really do make a difference, and have real world impact. So it's often hard to measure exactly what those impacts might be, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't think about those things and start to think about how we can measure them, and how, as a signatory base, we can start to incorporate them more and more into our investment decisions. So the focus, for the new framework is still on policies and processes and activities, but we are now spending more time on what really matters and including some of these measures of actual impact. And I think it's an important message that the PRI is sending, is that the sustainability, the actual real world outcomes matter, and that we should actually take the time and spend the effort to try to capture those in what we're doing.
And Faith?
And from my perspective, I mean, I completely agree with Brian's points. And I think what we do acknowledge is actually that this is actually quite challenging, because this is kind of newer to our kind of reporting, but certainly in line with what I'm being asked to do by my beneficiaries. So completely in line with kind of where the direction of travel is from society. And I think what the PRI are trying to achieve here is to make sure that the framework is future proof. It's actually capturing where we need to be, not just where we are now. So we do need to, because we don't want to keep reiterating and changing, although it's about kind of evolving sort of best practice. And I think it gives a space there for those who want to express and show the work that they're doing, and then others can also learn from that. So I think it's a really important development.
And Elina, what about from our perspective?
Yeah, from PRI perspective, probably worth mentioning, like Brian already mentioned, our 10-year blueprint. So we committed there, and it was in response to our signatory feedback then, that it was important that we started looking at this. So signatories are still sort of asking for this. So we had over 2/3 of signatories in our consultations indicating that they would like to see this captured in PRI reporting framework. So, I mean, and again, like Faith was saying, we know it's early days for this, but we also know that's important, and we know that if we will wait until we have the right answers, the sort of the saying about perfect becomes the enemy of the good, we have to start somewhere. So we have started in a very, very cautious way. I mean, there will be signatories who will say that we are not going far enough or quick enough, and there will be signatories who will say that this is a bit too fast and too soon. But we have this voluntary area on sustainability outcomes, which are completely voluntary. Like I said, it's the plus section, so you don't have to. But that's where signatories have started looking at it. They will be able to report, and others who might be interested in going that direction, they'll be able to learn. But probably more importantly, we have 5 indicators. So just to give you an idea, this is a really small number of indicators that are included in the core section that is very carefully starting to understand how signatories might be understanding their sustainability outcomes, intended and unintended. And I think that's also really important. So, I think that we are sort of carefully going that direction and hoping that it will help the industry as a whole.
Yeah, and that's a really important point, Elina, because one of the things when we're designing anything for our signatory base, but particularly when we're thinking about reporting, is that we've got signatories who are large, small, advanced, new to responsible investment, as I talked about in the beginning, come from all different parts of the world, and that they have different regulatory environments, and we need to make sure that our reporting is able to do that. So as you said, for some people it might be we're not going too far, that we're not going far enough. For some it might be that we're going too far. We have to try to find that happy medium for everyone. But I mentioned that we were also integrating TCFD aligned indicators into the core. Can you talk about that a little bit more and give people a bit of a flavour for how that will work?
Sure. So a basic principle, whatever was mandatory in 2020 continues to be mandatory in 2021. So all our strategy and governance questions continue to be in the core section. What's important that's changing as part of this being included in core is that the responses will be public. So there will be no choice to keep some of the responses private, and these will be scored. Again, assessment is private, so you hopefully will be able to learn from that rather than sort of. So hopefully that's clear on the strategy and governance. And then we have risk management and metrics and targets that will continue to be in the voluntary section of the reporting framework, with the aim to make those mandatory in 2022.
Thank you. I also touched on the issue about stewardship. So let's talk a little bit about why stewardship has been integrated throughout the framework instead of left as that separate module with its own assessment score.
Yeah, and so again, I mean, I'm clearly here getting nostalgic, so I want to take another step back and just think, originally we have active ownership, and we looked at this only in listed equity, and then we slowly sort of moved into some of the engagement questions and fixed income. So now we're looking at stewardship as a wider term, and we believe that stewardship good practice is conducted for one of the two main objectives. One is to incorporate a core part of ESG incorporation, and secondly is to drive outcomes on systemic issues that may go beyond a company or investment portfolio. So this is sort of reflected in the reporting framework structure, where stewardship is done with the objective of core ESG incorporation. This is all incorporated throughout the asset class modules, and separately we're asking signatories to describe how they're using stewardship tools to shape outcomes on their most important issues.
Thanks, Elina. So I also mentioned the fact that we've got this new C-level statement, and we're really asking about how the new C-level statement, that is, will contribute to raise awareness and accountability to the PRI reports. And so I think I'll ask a question of the signatories here, and maybe start with you, Faith, about the addition of this C-level statement.
Yeah, thank you, Fiona. And I think it's perfectly rational when you actually look at an annual report or even an RI report that a signatory might have produced themselves. They often start with a statement from the chair or the CEO, because it's a piece that kind of makes the report accessible. It tends to summarise kind of the key deliverables for the year, and really kind of lays out kind of, I suppose, how this is embedded within their culture and purpose as an organisation. So I think it sets that framing, and I think it's really important for that sort of accessibility, so that other people can kind of read those bits and get a sense of those organisations. So I think it's going to be really quite additive, as Elina says, to the value of the outputs, and I think is a relatively straightforward input.
And Brian, what's your view on this?
Yeah, I think, of course, I'd echo what Faith said. I think it's very helpful sort of context to provide people. But I think the other way it is going to be helpful is for, we have that whole 3,000 plus signatories and varying degrees of sort of engagement at different levels of organizations. And I think getting something written, at the executive level and having it reviewed and signed off at the executive level might prove to sort of generate more internal conversations, internal accountability, maybe help the understanding throughout the organization of their commitment to sustainable, responsible investing and what sort of practices they're taking. So I think it might just be a helpful tool in terms of helping people internally move things forward as they progress in their path and responsible investing.
Thanks. So, Elina, this has been a massive undertaking to do this review. Do you want to talk about what some of the main challenges have been?
What challenges? Yeah, well, it's I guess in a very sort of summarized version, I'd say that it's we're trying to do a lot for a lot of people, for a lot of with a lot of purposes and objectives in mind. But we're trying to do a simpler framework that still caters to the huge diversity of our signatory base, that's still challenging enough without creating a necessary reporting burden. So asking the right questions that potentially are still challenging, but they are still the questions need to be worth it, because we're ultimately all building sort of a better world through that. So yeah, it's been the juggling of all of those important objectives, and as we've talked about before, it's sometimes conflicting, but I feel like we have something good, I think.
Thanks, Elina. I think we have too. But that's really all we've got time for. I know we've been talking to you about a lot of change that we're bringing in, and I know that when we bring in changes to reporting, like I said in the beginning, it impacts all of our signatories. And we don't bring about change lightly. So I want to assure you that we understand that reporting takes time and that it takes effort, and that we've put a lot of thought into this, and that we've got a lot of input from you along the way. And we're doing it only because we want to advance responsible investment practices, that we need to take responsible investment to the next level, and we need to make sure that our reporting framework really keeps pace with the changes happening in the industry. But I also wanted to assure you that we're going to be here to assist signatories through the changes, that we're going to be here every step of the way. So the new reporting cycle will open in January through to March, and the first year of the reporting is a pilot. We will still be taking and incorporating feedback in 2021 and onwards to ensure that reporting does remain relevant and that it does reflect those industry standards and the industry evolution. We'll be running some webinars. We're going to be providing lots of tools and tutorials, and the PRI team, as I said, will be on hand to assist you. So please keep an eye on the website, where we'll continuously update with new resources. And rest assured, as I said, that our reporting team, but also all of our relationship managers in all the different countries that you're in, will be here to support you during the reporting process. So you're not alone. We're all in this together. So I really want to thank my panel. So thanks to Faith, thank you, Brian, thank you, Elina, for all of the amazing work and for talking us through it today. Thank you all for watching, and please stay safe and well.